The dominant position in the Mediterranean for many centuries was based on military skill, and this was one of the important factors that allowed the Romans were not only able to win wars, they rethought the art of warfare and turned military. Although the Romans had a large army, they did not rely solely on it. Their victories over larger barbarian. Let's look at 10 key tactics that could not only determine the full course of action, but also shape the image of the Roman. The first and incredibly important tactic of the Romans was the manipulator tactic, sometimes even called the manipulator formation. This tactic allowed the Roman army to adapt to a variety of terrain and combat conditions, and was a key factor in the success of the wars against the Gauls. Traditionally represented a dense formation of heavy armed infantry. They were also called hop. These disadvantages were low maneuverability, and all because the phalanx was effective on rough terrain. For this reason, the Romans developed the manipulator formation as a response to these challenges. Also, the manipulator formation had a special structure, and the basic unit of such in the first line were the Goths. These were the youngest and least experienced soldiers. However, by the time of the heyday of the manipular formation, the second line of the front were the Principes. These were more experienced, mature warriors. They were considered the core of the army and entered the battle only if the hostates could not break the resistance or needed reinforcements. Such manipulative tactics had their advantages. The very first factor was, of course, flexibility. It allowed the Romans to operate successfully on any terrain. They also had high endurance. And the very last factor was psychological pressure. Constant pressure from fresh forces could defeat the enemy. When the enemy thought that the resistance had broken, an example of successful application of such a system was, for example, the Sanitsky War, their Rome, or adopted and improved the ideas of flexible system. The second important tactic of the Romans was the tactic of the Pilum. This was the tactic of the Pilum had its own special design. It was unique and consisted of a shaft. The Pilum also had a tip. It was sharp, sometimes with teeth for maximum target impact. And the key idea of the Pilum was not only to inflict good damage, but also to disable the enemy's counts and also to disrupt their formation and create pressure. The next mechanism was the penetrating ability. The hardened, sharp Pilum was able to penetrate wooden shields and leather armor, and even some types of metal armor were also destroyed after such a blow. The thin rod passed through the material. Also, it disabled the bills after the shield was pierced. Soft iron rod pillars at the mast under the weight of the shaft, or when hitting the ground. This made the extraction of the Pilum from the enemy's bill almost impossible. Also, thanks to such a mechanism, it was possible to prepare. Over time, of course, the design of the Pilum was changed to improve combat. Heavy and light. The Pilum tactics ultimately showed the Romans' engineering prowess and pragmatic approach to warfare. This weapon was fairly easy to mass-produce, but also incredibly effective in use. It was the Pelion that allowed. The third tactic of the Romans was the gladius and scutum. They became the heart of the Roman infantry and the foundation of dominance on the battlefield. These two elements were not just equipment for warriors. They were a symbiotic system that could change the style of fighting and provide offensive. Let's first deal with the scutum. It was not just a shield, it was an individual mobile fortress that played an important role. It was an interesting design. It was a large rectangular or oval shield. It was made of several layers. Despite the fact that the scutrum was quite heavy, weighing between 5 and 8 kilograms, this is what provided it with strength. Of course, it also had protective properties. The scutum was also used in the tactical sphere. There was a so-called shield wall in a dense formation. Legionnaires formed an impenetrable wall of such scutums, and thus they could easily defend themselves from arrows, darts, or even stones that the enemies used. It had active protection. The structum was used not only for passive protection, but also. Now let's take a closer look at the gladius. It was a melee weapon. It was a short Roman sword that was ideal for close combat and was typical for the dense formation of the entire legion. The gladius had a total length of about 70 centimeters and a blade length of 50 centimeters. The blade was very wide, it was pointed at the end, and this could make it effective for both thrusting and chopping blows. There were also several types of gladius. For example, there was Mainz Pompey and Fulham. They differed slightly in the shape of the blade, however they could have different effects on the battlefield. Of course, the gladius was very effective in a tight formation. Unlike long balls or even spears, it was ideal for shield-to-shield combat. And all because in such combat, the space for maneuver was limited, Its short length could allow for quick and, most importantly, accurate strikes to the enemy's vulnerable spots. Such places could be the groin, stomach, neck, or even shoulders. With the help, gladius had its own length and balance. It could be a very fast and accurate weapon, and this allowed the legionary to when a legionary used the scutum for defense, and at the same time for control over an opponent, he could parry a blow with his shield, push the opponent and throw him off balance, and then he would deliver a quick, deadly thrust with the gladius. The basis of Roman tactics was the formation of a dense formation, where each legionary, however, against opponents with longer weapons, the Romans closed the distance as much as possible. As soon as they entered the gladius zone, the enemy's long weapon became very awkward and completely ineffective, while the Roman sword was ideal for such cases. And also, the mastery of the gladius and scutum required constant training from the warriors. Legionaries learned to move in formation as one organism. They synchronously blocked blows and tried to deliver stabbing blows using the scutum for attacks. Another very important factor was precisely the psychological impact. The sight of an advancing, dense wall of shields, from behind which deadly gladii suddenly jumped out, exerted strong psychological pressure on the enemy. The enemy was often confused, seeing that their attacks were useless against. Thus, the gladius and scutum remained the main elements of the Roman warriors' armament throughout the period of the Republic and the early Empire. Although their design and use may have changed in the later period of the Empire, the basic principles of their use in a dense formation were still preserved. Such tactics of using the gladius and scutum. The fourth battle tactic used by the Romans was siege warfare and engineering, which was the art of taking fortresses. It is well known that Roman military might was demonstrated not only on open battlefields. Roman siege warfare had its own philosophy, because unlike many other armies that could only rely on sudden assaults or long blockades, the Romans preferred to use a combination of methods, often resorting to works that were designed to minimize the losses of their troops and ensure success in battle. For them, a siege was not just an assault, but a carefully planned operation, where each stage had its. Let's look at each objective in a little more detail, because it's quite interesting and exciting. The first objective of this kind was reconnaissance and encirclement. Before starting the siege, a thorough reconnaissance of the area and the fortification itself was carried out. The most vulnerable points, water sources and approaches were determined. After that, the city was completely blocked in order to exclude The second purpose was long preparation, and of course engineering work, since the Romans rarely rushed into a direct assault without preliminary preparation. Instead, they preferred the painstaking work of creating the infrastructure for the siege. This included camps, roads and bridges, as well as siege engines with a huge arsenal. Let's now look at the key siege machines and tactics of the Romans. For example, we can remember the ballistas and catapults. These throwing machines were used to suppress defenders, destroy the battlements of walls, towers, and gates. Ballistas could shoot large arrows or darts. They looked like giant crossbows, with high accuracy. Onagers used a rotating mechanism to throw heavy stones along a trajectory. Thus, they caused destruction inside the city itself. What else should be mentioned is the siege towers. These were mobile wooden towers that were higher than the walls of the city under siege. They had several floors, on which the bulk of the archers, slingers, and soldiers were located, who were ready for the assault. At the base of the tower, there was often a battering ram. Siege towers were rolled up to the walls along specially built ramps, and then assault bridges were thrown from. Of course, it is necessary to look at the famous examples of Roman engineering genius, one of which was the Siege of Alesia. It was an outstanding example of Roman siege art. Since Caesar besieged the Gallic fortress of Alesia, where Vercingetorix was located, he was able to simultaneously besiege the city and defend himself from the huge Gallic army that was relieving him. Caesar built a double line of fortifications. Countervallation. Let's now take a closer look at the fifth tactic of the Romans. It was discipline and training. These two components were the steel backbone that allowed one to move with efficiency and withstand enormous loads. It was thanks to these two qualities that an ordinary Roman citizen was able to turn into a professional deadly legionnaire who was able to fight as part of a single organism. The Roman army was famous for its incredibly strict discipline, as it was necessary to maintain order and morale in conditions of danger and stress. Every day, legionaries spent hours training. This training included marching, drill, and combat training. Since the Roman army had a clear hierarchical structure from legate to centurion and simple legionary, unquestioning obedience to orders was mandatory. Any disobedience on the battlefield was punished very severely. Roman discipline was also reinforced by a strict system of punishments, designed to maintain order and instill fear of breaking the rules. The most terrible punishment for an entire unit was decimation. If a cohort or legion showed cowardice, every 10th soldier was chosen by lot and executed by his comrades. Punishment for individual soldiers was, in addition to the system of punishments, of course, the Roman army also had a system of rewards, which included various awards such as medals, necklaces, bracelets, loot, promotions in rank, and even land plots. Veterans could often receive land for themselves upon completion of their service. Discipline and training were the factors that allowed the Romans to compensate for great enemy superiority, to endure long campaigns, to recover from defeats. They created an army that was not just warriors, but a single, highly effective mechanism, each element of which knew its role and was ready to fulfill it to the very end. The sixth tactic was Roman fortifications and camp building. This was even one of the most underestimated but an important aspect of Roman camp construction was standardization. Each legionary was trained in engineering and always carried tools with him. This allowed fortifications to be built with maximum speed. After a day's march, the legion did not simply pitch tents, but began building a full-fledged camp. The first thing the Romans did was to select a site. The Romans also built a clear plan. All camps, regardless of size, were built on a rectangular plan which resembled a miniature Roman city. This ensured a quick construction process and also facilitated navigation within the camp. In the center was the Praetorium, and next to it was the Forum, where warehouses, medical centers, and other important objects were located. The streets of the camp were straight and intersected at right angles. They divided the camp into clear blocks for placing the tents of the cohorts and maniples. There were also routes for the rapid movement of troops, and each field camp was equipped with several levels of defense, which provided high protection even against sudden attacks. First, a deep ditch was dug around the entire perimeter of the camp, and the earth from it was poured inside, forming an earthen rampart. This created an obstacle for the enemy and an elevation for the defenders. At the top of the rampart, a palace. Let's look at various examples and legacies of such camps. First, we can look at Caesar's campaign in Gaul, since almost every night in Gaul ended with the construction of a camp. This allowed Caesar to act aggressively, knowing that his troops were always safe. Also, the Hadrian and Antonine walls were grand defensive structures that demonstrated Roman skill in building extensive fortifications to protect the borders of the empire. The Roman mastery of fortification and camp building was not a simple skill. It was an integral part of their military strategy, which ensured the endurance, security, and logistical efficiency of their armies, allowing them to dominate opponents who often lacked such capabilities. This ability to transform any point into a fortified position was one of the key factors in their unprecedented conquests. The Roman mastery of fortification and camp building was no simple skill. It was an integral part of their military strategy, ensuring the endurance, security, and logistical efficiency of their armies, allowing them to dominate opponents who lacked similar capabilities. This ability to turn any point into a fortified position was one of the key factors in their conquests. The next important factor was logistics and supply. The true power of the Roman military machine lay not only in its fighting qualities, but also in its unrivaled system of logistics and supply. Ancient Rome was one of the first states to realize that a well-supplied army is much more dangerous than a hungry one. Without effective logistics, great generals like Caesar would not have been able to conduct long campaigns over vast distances, maintaining the fighting ability of their legions for many months and even years. Roman logistics began long before a campaign. Even before the troops moved out, cities and provinces would stockpile huge quantities of grain, dried meat, and salt. These stockpiles were stored in specially equipped warehouses called horaea. The Roman state would contract with private suppliers to deliver the necessary food and equipment to specific locations. An important key to the success of efficient logistics gave the Romans enormous strategic advantages, such as the ability to wage wars far from Rome for many years, as in Gaul or in the wars against Mithridates. Also, Roman generals could plan and carry out operations without running out of supplies, and well-fed and equipped soldiers were more resilient, less susceptible to disease, and more motivated to fight. Let's look at important examples of logistics in Ribla, the first example being the Punic Wars. Hannibal, despite his genius, ultimately lost, partly because of the problems of supplying his army in Italy, while the Romans, even after defeats, were able to replenish their ranks and supplies, and Caesar constantly paid attention to logistics. His ability to quickly build bridges and roads to provide supplies to thousands of soldiers in the hostile conditions of Gaul was one of the foundations of his triumph. Thus, the Roman logistics and supply system was an invisible but powerful factor that allowed their armies to be not only a formidable force in battle, but also an unstoppable machine of conquest, capable of maintaining their presence and fighting over distances and for long periods of time. Let's look at the seventh tactic, which was combined forces and specialization. The Roman military machine was not a monolithic formation consisting only of heavy infantry. Its outstanding superiority was also achieved through the skillful use of combined arms and the high specialization of units. The Romans understood perfectly well that no type of troops could be universal on all types of terrain and against all types of enemies. Let's study the role of legions in the Roman army. They were always based on heavy infantry. Legions. They bore the brunt of the battle, withstood frontal attacks, broke through the enemy's line. The discipline, training, and weapons of the legionaries made them invincible in close combat. However, the legions themselves had their limitations. The greatest skill of a Roman commander was the ability to coordinate the actions of all these specialized units. The battle began with the skirmishers and archers starting a skirmish, weakening the enemy. Then came a massive volley of legionnaires' pilums. The legions entered into close combat, breaking through the enemy's center. While the legions pinned down the enemy in the center, the cavalry tried to get around its flank. Now let's look at examples of effectiveness. First, we can recall the Battle of Pharsalus, where Caesar, faced with Pompey's numerically superior army, which had strong cavalry, used his legions to hold the center, and then suddenly brought out hidden cohorts to counterattack Pompey's cavalry, which was trying to outflank him. This led to the rout of the cavalry and the subsequent defeat of Pompey, and as the empire developed, specialization deepened. Specialized naval units, border troops, and even guards emerged. The Romans were among the first to systematically integrate engineers, scouts, and artillery into the regular army. This desire to combine the strengths of different types of troops and peoples was a key element that enabled Rome to maintain military dominance for many centuries. Coming to the eighth technique, it is worth mentioning the Roman command and management structure, because this was the real mind of the legion. The Romans created a clear, hierarchical, and effective chain of command, which allowed huge armies to act as one organism and quickly respond to changes on the battlefield. This organized structure, together with the qualities of the Roman generals, was the so-called brain of the Roman military machine. Now let's take a closer look at the hierarchy of command in Rome. At the top stood the supreme commander. In the Republic, this was one of the two consuls in the empire, the emperor himself or a legate appointed by him. This same legate was the highest military leader and responsible for the entire army. He made strategic decisions, determined the general plan of battle, and led the actions of large units. Under the legate were the next in the hierarchy were the options. They were the assistants of the centurion, and stood in the rear of the sentry and also ensured order, discipline, and the transmission of orders. After them were the decurions. They commanded squads of 10 cavalrymen. And the very last were the decans. These were such junior commanders. It is also worth considering in more detail the principles of control in battle. Roman commanders always sought to give the clearest and simplest orders that could be quickly passed along the chain of command. And in the noisy conditions of battle, visual and sound signals played an important role. One of these signals were the standard bearers. They carried the standards of the units. The movement of these signs served as visual signals for maneuvers. There were also musicians, such as trumpets. The next principle was flexibility at the lower level. Although general orders came from above, centurions and legionaries had a certain amount of tactical autonomy at the lower level. Trained soldiers could make their own decisions in small battles, such as how best to use their shield and sword in a particular encounter, or how to temporarily deviate from the general formation to get around an obstacle and then quickly return. Also important was the connection with siege machines. In the case of sieges, commanders also coordinated the actions of legionnaires using siege machines such as ballistas, catapults, battering rams, with sapper work and assault groups. You are probably wondering now, what qualities did Roman commanders have? And I will tell you. They were not only strategists, but also leaders who were able to inspire their soldiers. Roman commanders often an important quality for commanders was the ability to inspire and the ability to make convincing speeches before a battle, to appeal to patriotism and valor. According to the Romans, a commander also had to be both severe, punishing cowardice, and fair, encouraging bravery and merit. This clear command structure, effective system of transmitting orders, such an organized hierarchy, from the rank and file to the commander-in-chief, ensured the smooth functioning of the entire Roman system and allowed it to achieve absolute victories while maintaining its dominance for many centuries. And now we move on to the ninth tactics, which consisted of the psychology of war and propaganda. Since the Romans were not only masters of tactics and logistics, but also outstanding psychologists, they understood perfectly well that war was not only a battle of armies, but also a battle for the human mind. I suggest you first consider the appearance and reputation of the legion, since first impressions mattered. The Romans projected an image of their army as an invincible, disciplined, and intimidating force. Although the Roman uniform was not as standard as the modern one, legionnaires wore similar armor and weapons. This uniform appearance, especially in close formation, could create discipline, and order should not be forgotten either, because the sight of a legion marching in perfect formation, capable of building a fortified camp in a few hours, showed discipline and organization. This inspired fear and respect, making the enemy doubt their strength. The Romans also actively used their reputation. Let's now look at the demoralization of the enemy of the Romans themselves. They used various tactics to suppress the enemy's will to resist even before or even during the battle. One such example was mass executions and cruelty towards those who showed stubborn resistance. The Romans could show demonstrative cruelty. For example, they completely destroyed. The enemy could also be very surprised and confused as soon as there was a sudden appearance of significant Roman forces in an unexpected place. This also caused them to panic. And one of the key Roman strategies was that it was necessary to divide and rule. The Romans actively used disagreements between enemy tribes or states, concluding alliances and offering favorable conditions to some. This undermined the unity of the enemy. In most cases, Roman tactics in close combat rarely and sweetly retreat. Legionnaires went forward, pressing the enemy, which often broke the will of the enemy, who expected temporary attacks and retreats. But do not forget about maintaining the spirit of their own troops, because the psychological impact was directed not only at the enemy, but also at their own soldiers. The Romans, of course, had a system of rewards and incentives, because remembering the cruel punishments, the system of rewards for bravery created a powerful motivation. Soldiers fought not only out of fear, but also out of a desire for glory and recognition. They also had various religious rituals, such as prayers, sacrifices, and favorable omens, before the battle strengthened the soldiers' faith in divine support and their own righteousness. Now let's take a closer look at the diplomacy of the Romans, because they actively used it not only to conclude alliances, but also as a tool of psychological warfare. Quite often they issued various ultimatums, for example demands for unconditional surrender, backed up by a show of force, often forced the enemy to surrender without a fight. But the Romans did not forget about negotiations. They skillfully conducted them, offering conditions that could split hostile alliances or incline individual tribes to go over to the side of Rome. Thus, the psychology of war and propaganda were an integral part of the warfare waged by the Romans. They understood that the straw spirit of the enemy's resistance, internal strife and demoralization, could be more effective than even thousands of swords. The combination of fearsome military force with skillful diplomacy, demonstration of superiority and psychological pressure allowed. And finally, we come to the 10th military tactic of the Romans. This is the last tactic for today. It was adaptability and innovation. It was the continuous learning and improvement of warriors. Unlike many other civilizations the first thing the Romans did was of course learn from their defeats. Despite the fact that the Romans were virtually invincible, they also suffered crushing defeats from the Gauls. An example would be the Battle of the Allia, the Samnites, and of course Hannibal at Cannae. However, instead of breaking down, they decided to use these failures as lessons. The first lesson that the Romans learned was the transition from the phalanx to the maniples. The defeats by the Samnites, who fought in more flexible formations on rough terrain, forced the Romans to abandon the huge phalanx and adopt the manipular formation. After that, they realized that they had to make their pilum because it gave them the ability to disable the enemy's shields due to the bending rod of the pilum. And finally, the big lesson was taught by the fight with Hannibal. Thus, at the core of this adaptability was the deep-rooted Roman culture of pragmatism and efficiency. They were not simply bound to outdated traditions if those traditions ultimately hindered their victory. The outcome was much more important to them, and it was this mindset that allowed them to build, destroy, learn, and even change at times, thus turning their army into an ever-evolving and even deadly machine that was able to dominate a rapidly changing world and earn well-deserved victories in battle.